Welcome to another episode of The Watchdog with me, Lowkey, here on MintPress, going against the grain, week in, week out, going into the nooks and crannies of our society to tease out some of the most pertinent bits of information which can help you understand the way in which our society is run and controlled. Now, this week we have a very special episode focusing specifically on the West African state of Niger. We are currently seeing the aftermath of a military coup in the country. While Niger is the world's seventh largest provider of uranium, it is also seventh on the world's most poor countries. We have seen a military coup which has had support from large sections of the society sweep the previously existing government out of the way. But what we've also seen is an escalation, unfortunately, from both regional and other powers. We know that Niger happens to house around 1,000 US soldiers. It also hosts around 1,500 French soldiers, a few hundred German soldiers, and a few hundred Italian soldiers also. But what we've seen since the coup has happened is the military administration has suspended all security coordination with both the United States and France, and it has banned the export of uranium to France. Both the French and the United States have stubbornly refused to remove their troops from Niger. And we are seeing a situation where, unfortunately, the neighbors in Nigeria and ECOWAS, the economic community of West African states, seeking seemingly an escalation. And it is being strongly implied that military intervention could be on the cards. Now, to discuss this week, we are joined by David Hundeyin, who is a Nigerian journalist, an activist, an author, and the founder of West Africa Weekly. David, thank you very much for joining us this week. The first question I want to ask you is, what has happened in Niger?
So, long story short, this is one of the poorest countries in the world, which for most of its history has been ruled by its military. For the first time ever in its history, in 2020, there was a peaceful transfer of power from one civilian administration to another, in what was, to all intents and purposes, a democratic election. And then at the start of this month, there was a coup. There was a military coup. The president, Mohamed Bazoum, was ousted, and a military junta took power. Now, ordinarily, that wouldn't be this is a region of West Africa that is known colloquially as the coup belt. So this wouldn't be headline news. There have been coups recently in Chad, in Guinea, in Mali, which are just like nearby. So this really wouldn't have been such a headline, were it not for the fact that Niger happens to be strategically important to both France and the US. Now, Niger is one of the world's top suppliers of uranium. In fact, Niger supplies essentially 33% of France's total electricity consumption via its uranium. Niger also hosts a US Air Force drone base in Agadez in central Niger. Drone base is worth approximately $100 million. And more importantly, from an American point of view, it's considered to be central to US power projection, military power projection in the Sahel and West African region. And then almost as importantly, Niger is supposed to host part of the route of a proposed pipeline from Nigeria to Europe, a gas pipeline. And the purpose of that pipeline essentially is to wean Europe off energy dependency on Russia and essentially give Europe more leverage over its own energy consumption by sourcing for gas from Nigeria, which is obviously is a significantly weaker trading partner than Russia. So based on these three factors, Nigeria is, through no real importance of the Nigerian economy to the global economy or the Nigerian people, objectively speaking, Nigeria has suddenly become like a global headline, right? And what, in my opinion, what has been lost in all of this is what exactly the Nigerian people actually think or actually feel about any of this. The overarching narrative has been that this is primarily a Russian thing. So this is Russia trying to counteract the US and the West by turning Niger potentially into a theater for a proxy war. That this coup has been provoked by the Russians as a way of stifling Europe's attempt to gain energy independence from Russia, and to weaken the US's military power projection ability in the Sahel and in West Africa, as well as to strategically weaken France by weakening the French hold on Niger's uranium. Because one of the very first decisions that was made when the coup regime came into office was all export of uranium to France was suspended, and the US was also urged to evacuate their troops. I think about 1,100 troops that they have currently at the drone base from Niger. Both the US and France refused. The US said they would not evacuate, and the French, in my opinion, a bit ridiculously insisted that they would not basically let go of the uranium mines, which happen to be located in what is supposedly a sovereign independent country. And the French said, no, we don't recognize this government as a valid government. And the contracts we have are with the government which was democratically elected. That's the government we recognize. So that's what's going on from an American, a French, and a Russian point of view. Now, from the Nigerian point of view, and again, I have to stress, this is not necessarily taking any side specifically. This is just stating what the facts are from different points of view. Now, from the Nigerian point of view, rightly or wrongly, this coup is being seen or has been successfully sold as an anti-imperialist power movement, basically, like a popular movement against French imperialism. And the general idea on the streets in Niger is that, look, we have been independent for coming on to 60 years now. During that time, we've been trading almost exclusively with France. France has a stranglehold on any significant parts of the Nigerian economy, as it does in most other parts of the so-called France-Afrique. Niger exports, as I mentioned, close to 33% of the total energy mix of France via its uranium. Meanwhile, Niger is dependent on electricity supply. Is dependent on Nigeria for its electricity supply. Up to 70% of Niger's electricity supply comes from Nigeria. So essentially, a country that exports 33% of the energy mix of a global top 5 economy itself is 70% reliant on another country for basic electricity supply. And in fact, when this issue broke out and the Nigerian president, I'm coming to that in a minute, but I'm just mentioning this quickly. The Nigerian president unilaterally made a decision to switch off electricity supply to Niger. Even the Nigerian government house, right, the presidential palace in Niamey, was thrown to darkness. That's how dependent Niger is, and that's how poor Niger is. So from the point of view of the Nigerian people, this is a popular uprising against French imperialism and French domination of their economy. They believe that by breaking out of the stranglehold that the French have on Niger's diplomatic relations, on Niger's economy, on Niger's global trading outlook, that this will give them a future better than the sort of grinding poverty that they and their parents before them have have been accustomed to. Now, from the point of view of the neighbors, the neighboring countries of Niger, there are roughly two camps. So on the one hand, you have countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Chad, who have signaled in many different ways that they would wish to offer their support to the junta in Niger for very similar reasons. The people in those countries and the administration in charge of those countries also happen to believe that France Afrique essentially is a colonial pact which has maintained all of them in grinding poverty, and that if Africa wants to have a future, then it needs to break out of that stifling relationship which it currently has with France. That it's a one-sided relationship which benefits France and which does nothing for the countries which are part of this partnership. So those four countries that I mentioned have actually signaled that in the event of any sort of military expedition into Niger, that they would actually send troops to Niger to actually provide military assistance. And then on the other hand, you have countries like Nigeria, which is possibly, not possibly, Nigeria is by far the strongest single member of the so-called ECOWAS bloc. ECOWAS is an acronym that means the Economic Community of West African States. It's by far the biggest economy in ECOWAS. Is about $510 billion worth of GDP. Also the most populated country in ECOWAS, roughly about 210 million people. So Nigeria has adopted a position that under no circumstances is a coup in Niger acceptable, and that the administration of Mohamed Bazoum must be returned to power. And that is the baseline. That is the position that it considers to be the minimum acceptable position, that the military currently in charge of Niger must stand down and must relinquish power, and they must do so immediately. So that's kind of like the basic overview of what is happening.
Thank you, David. Would you also be able to break down for us whether that position which you've laid out there as the position of the leadership of ECOWAS, could you just let us know if that position is actually uniform across the whole of ECOWAS? And also, could you tell us a bit more about the makeup of ECOWAS as a bloc, please?
It's a bloc of 15 countries in West Africa. So the meaning of the acronym is Economic Community of West African States. So you have countries like Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Mali, Senegal, Mauritania, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and a couple of Guinea, and what's the last one?
Cape Verde, maybe.
That's the one. Yeah. So Nigeria is by far the predominant power in ECOWAS. What ECOWAS supposedly exists to do is to be a customs union, a free trade zone, and a free movement area within West Africa. So the idea is if you have the passport of any of these listed countries, which automatically is an ECOWAS passport, you have free movement within the region. So on paper, you are free to live, trade, travel as you please within the ECOWAS region. Now, Nigeria is by far the predominant power within the ECOWAS region for obvious reasons. It's by far the biggest economy in ECOWAS. It's worth as much as 30% of the total economy of ECOWAS on its own. It has by far the largest population center in ECOWAS, 210 million people. It has by far the biggest military in ECOWAS. So Nigerian military has, depending on who is doing tabulation, has anything from 300,000 to 500,000 fighting men. It has the largest air force as well in ECOWAS. I think about 200 and something airframes, active airframes. So that puts Nigeria in a unique position of power within ECOWAS. So every single time there's ever been a military expedition that has been authorized by ECOWAS, it has essentially been the Nigerian military primarily supplying the bulk of the manpower and the equipment and the funding, with some contribution from like the Ghanaians and the Senegalese, the Ivorians. So in this instance, ECOWAS is definitely not united around a singular viewpoint. In general, there are 3 points of view. The first, as I mentioned, countries like Mali, Guinea, what's the final one? Not Senegal. Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso have basically positioned themselves very much on the side of the coup regime in Niamey, and they've basically said in the event of any ECOWAS military expedition into Niger, that they will essentially send their troops, which would, to all intents and purposes, be the end of ECOWAS as a going concern, because you can't have a free trade area, a customs union, an area of such close diplomatic cooperation, and then you're having countries within this area fighting an actual shooting war against each other. It simply doesn't work. So there's that point of view. The second point of view is significantly less sympathetic, but is a lot more cautious as well. So that's why you have countries like Ghana. So their position is the coup regime in Niamey should be negotiated with, and that there should be some sort of timetable that should be agreed for a transition back to an elected civilian administration, and that there needs to be some sort of negotiation with the coup regime to find out exactly, what happens to Mohamed Bazoum and his family, who, if possible, shouldn't be hurt. So they don't favor any sort of military expedition into ECOWAS. That is completely out of the question for them. Sorry, they don't favor any kind of military expedition into Niger. That's completely out of the question for them. But they also believe that the junta in Niger should also be made to cede power, but that should be done using negotiation and diplomatic levers as against war and economic sanctions. And then the third point of view, which is by far the most hawkish point of view, is that which has been pushed by countries like Nigeria, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire, who have signaled their readiness and willingness to send armed forces into Niger to forcefully, if possible, remove the junta, to basically displace the Nigerian military and occupy the country, and then forcefully reinstate Mohamed Bazoum into office. So those are generally the 3 main points of view within ECOWAS. So it's by no means united around a singular viewpoint. In fact, I can say this authoritatively. The last time, I think this was just over a week ago, there was a meeting in the Nigerian capital in Abuja. It was a meeting of the defense chiefs, the ministers of defense of all ECOWAS member states, and at that meeting, the Ghanaian defense chief actually threatened to walk out because the position that was being sort of forced through by Nigeria was a pro-war position. So they are definitely not in agreement around what to do with Niger. I think it's fair to say that most ECOWAS member states prefer that a non-military solution should be adopted. It's the countries you would expect to be in favor of a military solution are the countries which are obviously very much under French, I don't want to use the word control, but are very heavily dominated by their diplomatic relationship with France, such as Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire. Nigeria seems to be the odd one out because typically Nigeria has the linchpin of Nigeria's foreign policy is something called the Africa First Doctrine. At least that's what we're taught in school. However, we're in a very sort of unique, unprecedented set of circumstances now, where the current sitting Nigerian head of state, who came into power 4 months ago, is, for lack of a better term, acting as a diplomatic puppet and seems determined to drag Nigeria into a war which nobody wants. Nobody in Nigeria wants that war. Nobody in Niger wants it either. Most ECOWAS member states and their citizens do not want it. So it seems to be that the current head of Nigeria's government is acting at cross purposes, even with his own government. Because I'll also mention this, that roughly 2 weeks ago, he actually tried to start this war illegally. Under Nigerian law, a president or a head of state is not permitted to deploy the Nigerian military outside the borders of Nigeria without express permission from the Senate, from the Parliament. But he actually tried to circumvent that. He used an executive order to deploy Nigerian special forces into Niger to enforce a no-fly zone. If you remember what happened with Libya in 2011, you know very well what a no-fly zone is, what that euphemism actually means. It's an act of war. And the military was so very much not on board with this that certain individuals, shall we say, within the chain of command actually acted and made sure that the order itself, the secret document from the defense headquarters, was actually leaked to me, of all people, because I am not considered to be a friend of the Nigerian government at all. So for them to leak this, not just to any journalist, but to me, of all people, and then obviously they knew I would put it out, which I did. And that actually succeeded in stopping that illegal invasion for the time being. So, but why I mentioned that is just to give you an idea of just how much opposition the idea of war faces, even within the armed forces, even within the military. Nobody wants this war. But the Nigerian president and the presidents of Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire seem very, very much willing to act as extensions of French and US foreign policy as against presidents of the country that they're leading. So that's the current situation we have.
And also, it has been voted down by the Nigerian Senate, if I remember correctly. Now, David, you're speaking about a particular character here, Bola Tinubu, who, is the president of Nigeria. But would you be able to tell us who is he other than that? And what is his role exactly at ECOWAS? Also, you've described him as a US intelligence asset. What do you mean by that? And could you also tell us about his FBI file that you are hoping to obtain at the moment?
Okay, so he's the current sitting president of Nigeria who came to power on May 29, following what was widely accepted to be one of the most flawed and incoherent elections that Nigeria has ever put together. There's an EU observer mission report, which is publicly available. You can actually read through that. If you Google it, you'll find it. And the report essentially concludes that there is no basis to support the conclusion that this Bola Tinubu actually won the election. However, he was declared the winner at 4 a.m. in the morning when everyone was asleep. And currently, there's a legal challenge going on by the two major opposition parties and candidates challenging the supposed victory, and not just challenging the supposed victory, but also challenging his very candidacy, because there has also been a surplus of evidence to support the position that he should never have been on the ballot. He's not legally qualified to run for office, and he committed several perjuries on his presidential declaration, which violates Nigerian electoral law. So that is ongoing. Actually, the verdict for the case is actually due to be delivered sometime within the coming few weeks, because the case presentations have already ended. So he currently, as the president of Nigeria, he's also the chairperson of ECOWAS, because the ECOWAS chair is a rotational position. So it happened to be Nigeria's turn, which coincided with when he came into office. So presently, he happens to be the chair of ECOWAS, which fortunately or unfortunately has placed him in a uniquely influential position in the midst of this crisis. Now, why I referred to him on more than one occasion as the U.S. intelligence asset, that could be the subject of an entire interview on itself, right? I've actually done a story about this. This is someone who is very well known to the U.S. authorities as someone who comes from a criminal background. Right? His initial fortune, which propelled him into politics in Nigeria, was made from heroin trading, from heroin trafficking in Chicago. And this wasn't just an allegation or something which was reported. This was something that the US government itself essentially convicted him on. The thing was, he wasn't, as at the time when the federal case surrounding this took place in 1992, he was actually in Nigeria running for elective office. So instead of a criminal conviction, all that was obtained was a forfeiture, something called a civil asset forfeiture, where the proceeds of crime are seized from the criminal. So he forfeited close to $500,000 from the US government, being proceeds of heroin trafficking. This is all on US public record, by the way. So you can walk into the courts in the Northern District of Illinois, Eastern Division, in Chicago. You pay the filing fee and they'll give you this document. This document formed the basis for the story that I did last year. So this is very well known. And it just seems very convenient that someone with that kind of background, who then went into politics in Nigeria and is well known to the US authorities as someone with a criminal background in the US, was not only able to continue laundering his money in the US, because if you read that story, you could see the vast number and array of real estate transactions he was able to keep on making in the US, buying up properties worth millions of dollars in cash, no mortgage, right? Without any clear or defined source of income, which is supposed to raise every single money laundering and KYC red flag in the book. Somehow he was able to keep on doing it until as recently as last year, right? So that, first of all, there's no way the US was not aware of all of this. And secondly, and more importantly, during that time, between 1992 and present, he's very well known for having extremely close to the US Embassy in Nigeria. Now, when this was known colloquially, but when the WikiLeaks cables were released, this was when we had sort of concrete evidence of this. If you go to the WikiLeaks website and you literally just search his name, do that and just look through the cables, you will see. So he's essentially a US informant, right? He's an intelligence asset. I wouldn't describe him as an agent, because an agent is a trained US intelligence operative working for maybe the NSA or the CIA. I don't think he's that, but he's definitely the US intelligence asset, right? And clearly, it would seem to be the case that, as is done, very regularly, not just by the US, but even by countries like France, Russia, the UK, when trying to project your power internationally by sort of influencing the electoral outcomes of other countries so that you can, have friendly people coming into power, one of the best ways of ensuring that you get your way is to support people whom you have some sort of leverage over. And to my eyes, this will seem like the perfect kind of leverage to have over someone who wants to be president of Africa's largest economy and the largest regional power in West Africa. If you know that you have this person's criminal records, under lock and key, because, by the way, I should also mention that the records that are publicly available are just like the tip of the iceberg. He has other criminal records which are basically sealed, which you don't have access to, right? So currently, I am in court right now, in at least two different instances, right? We sued actually it's more than two, because we sued the FBI, we sued the DEA, we sued the IRS, we sued the CIA, and we sued the US attorneys, essentially for refusing to grant access under the Freedom of Information framework to the records of this guy, right? And what we were told was, look, due to privacy concerns, we're not going to give you access to this information. However, I think it's common sense to state that invoking privacy concerns is redundant when the person concerns the president of a sovereign country. That's a public official. So you cannot invoke privacy concerns over the criminal history of a public official. That wouldn't work in the US. That certainly wouldn't fly in the US, but because it's in a foreign jurisdiction, which nobody has to care about, that has been invoked. So we're currently in courts, right? And there's a lot of dribbling, there's a lot of fast and loose, and it just seems very clear to me that the US establishment is determined not to let go of whatever information it has about this guy, and it does have information. I know for a fact that there is an FBI file on him. Every U.S. federal criminal has an FBI file on them. If you've been part of a federal criminal case in the U.S., you as a matter of fact, do have an FBI file on you. We filed a freedom of information request to the FBI. Again, they said, due to privacy concerns, we can neither confirm nor deny the existence of this file, blah, 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 blah. So we're in court. And the process can take anything from a few months to many years. That's just the reality of the situation. So essentially, Nigeria currently is being occupied. I wouldn't say led or ruled, but being occupied by essentially an illegitimate head of state, because according to the data that the US government itself paid for prior to the election, this guy had no chance of winning, basically. There's no evidence that he won the election. So basically, you have an illegitimate president who is essentially potentially being blackmailed by foreign powers who have leverage over him, who is determined to drag Nigeria into a war that both the Nigerian parliament and the Nigerian citizenry and the Nigerian military, as a matter of fact, do not want. So that's the sort of very weird situation that we find ourselves in. This would be something which sounds like it came out of like a James Bond novel or something. This wasn't the kind of thing that I thought I would ever see in my lifetime, but here we are.
So, David, you've said that the US is prepared to burn everyone to keep themselves warm. What do you mean by that?
In this instance, what I meant by that was in pursuit of US foreign, what's the word I'm looking for? Foreign policy objectives or foreign policy goals, everyone who gets hurt in the process is viewed as pretty much unimportant, collateral damage. So in this case, the foreign policy goal of the US is, first of all, maintain its power projection ability in the Sahel region by keeping hold of that drone base. And basically, it feels as if the only way to keep hold of that drone base and ensure that it can keep on using it is to ensure that a friendly regime is in place in Niger. And then it's also US foreign policy that the move to grant Europe energy independence from Russia by essentially building a huge, incredibly impractical gas pipeline from Nigeria to Europe, it best serves its interests, and that can only be achieved and protected when a friendly regime in Niger is in power. So essentially, at any and every cost, the regime of Mohamed Bazoum must be returned, even though the Nigerian people, by and large, have made it very clear there's a plethora of information available out there, public demonstrations, there's all sorts of things. The Nigerians have made it clear that, rightly or wrongly, I personally think that supporting a military coup doesn't really tend to end well based on the history of Africa. Just generally, I think they may be making a mistake. But the fact is, that's democracy in a manner of speaking. The people of Niger are determined that whatever came before this coup regime was so abominable that they'd rather support a military junta than an unpopular government of Mohamed Bazoum that came before it. Well, who is anyone to sort of force the unwanted president back on them using military might, using military force? And the problem, why I said the US is going to set us on fire, is that this is not like Nigeria going to war with Ethiopia. There's no way to actually distinguish between who is Nigerian and who is Nigerian. Like the closest comparison that I can think of would be like the US going to war with Canada. That it's a ridiculous idea. It's utterly daft. You can't functionally distinguish between the two. The border, or the supposed border between Nigeria and Niger, is not a natural border. There is no border. It's the same people on both sides of the border. It's just an imaginary line in the sand that was drawn in Berlin. You can't, functionally speaking, the border is not demarcated, it's not manned or policed. There's no way to distinguish who is Nigerian and who is Nigerian. They speak the same language, lived as the same people for many centuries, long before the US existed as an entity. So how can you say that Nigeria should go declare war on a neighbor that it cannot functionally, distinguish itself from? It's a crazy idea to even try to implement. And then secondly, let's say, for the sake of argument, that it's even possible to wage war against Niger to defeat the Nigerians. Let's say the Russians don't get involved. Let's say the Malians and the Burkinabes and the Chadians get involved. Somehow the Nigerian military is able to subdue everything and everyone. The under-equipped Nigerian military that cannot subdue Boko Haram within its own borders is going to somehow take on 3 or 4 countries and win. Let's say that happens for the sake of argument. Now, bear in mind that Niger is essentially the only buffer that Nigeria has from Libya. Libya is a total chaos zone. Ever since the invasion of 2011, Libya is essentially no man's land. And Libya was also one of the most heavily armed countries in the world. And all those armed stockpiles have fallen into all sorts of non-state hands since 2011 and keep on falling into non-state hands. Niger is the one buffer that Nigeria has between it and total chaos. As much as Nigeria has issues, as much as Nigeria has the problems that it has, Nigeria is still a relatively stable country. And it still has a relatively prosperous economy relative to the rest of Africa, right? If the Nigerian military is then forced to essentially play the role of the Nigerian military by manning the border with Libya, a function that it has not been able to accomplish within Nigeria, you are not going to deploy to a foreign country to do what it couldn't do at home. And then essentially you have the already overstretched Nigerian military trying to essentially act as the police of 2 countries. Bear in mind, Niger is geographically 1.25 times the size of Nigeria. On so many levels, this is going to end in an absolute disaster. And what's going to happen is we're going to import the chaos from Libya directly into Nigeria. We're going to start having suicide bombings in Lagos. There's going to be absolute mayhem. And as usual, when that happens, what's the US going to do? They're going to wash their hands of it. That's what they always do. It's not going to be that. That's what they did in Libya. They washed their hands of it. They said, well, tough luck. And they moved on.
David, can you just break down for us what is Nigeria's exact position on AFRICOM?
As I said, officially, the linchpin of Nigeria's foreign policy doctrine is this thing called the Africa First policy, which came into being in the 1970s. On paper, Nigeria is opposed, first of all, to any sort of foreign military deployment within its borders, on paper. At different times, the US and the British militaries have made requests to the Nigerian government to site bases or do things like that. And each time they've been knocked back. They've been turned down. The Nigerian diplomatic community, intelligence community, and armed forces are, generally speaking, very strongly opposed to any sort of foreign military deployment within Nigeria's borders or even within Nigeria's neighborhood, because the classic way of thinking within these spaces is that Nigeria should dominate its own immediate sphere of influence, right? So the dominant military force within the West African sub-region should be Nigeria. That's the thinking of the establishment, which I think makes some sense. However, with the entry of someone like Bola Tinubu into the presidency in Nigeria, I think it's fair to say that, if that doesn't change, if his status as president persists, every possibility is open. All doors are opened, because clearly he doesn't really answer to Nigeria. There's no evidence that Nigeria made him its president, so he answers to the people who recognize him, right? So he answers to Joe Biden, he answers to Kamala Harris, he answers to Anthony Blinken. He doesn't answer to us. So there is every possibility that despite Nigeria's sort of reflexive and antagonism to AFRICOM and to any sort of US military deployment within Nigeria's sphere of influence, it could happen. Under a continued Tinubu presidency, you might very well see a US military base on Nigerian soil, something which is currently considered to be an abomination, but it's a distinct possibility now.
Also, David, we've seen recently in Mali the forced exit of 2,500 French soldiers. You also saw in Burkina Faso at the beginning of the year, French soldiers forced to leave the country. And now in Niger, you are seeing, in a way, the birth pangs of a movement to force the French to leave. You're seeing Mali, for instance, dump French as an official language. In other ways, you're seeing the French language decrease in its usage in Africa. Are we seeing some sort of retreat of the French from Africa?
I would be very cautious about using terms like retreat because they sound, in my opinion, they sound very triumphal. They sound very triumphalist. And if there's one thing we know about colonial or neo-colonial powers is that they never just walk away and leave it be. There's always going to be something. There's always going to be another attempt. There's always going to be, they're always working the angle. So I don't purport to speak for the francophone population of West Africa because I think they're capable of speaking for themselves. But also, I think it's fair to say that if you've had any sort of extensive interaction with them, generally speaking, across francophone Africa, there's a very pronounced antipathy toward French involvement in their government and in their economies. And this isn't just some airy-fairy political talking point. France actually has very, very, very real day-to-day influence in Francophone Africa in ways that those of us, even like in Anglophone Africa, would find absolutely absurd, right? Because, for example, countries within the CFA zone. So the CFA is a French-backed currency which 14 African countries use, right? And it's essentially a currency union which is backed and guaranteed by France. And in return for being backed and guaranteed by France, these 14 countries have to store 50% of their total foreign reserves with the Banque de France in Paris. They are not allowed to raise debts on their own without permission from Paris. So the basic instruments of government that a sovereign country should have access to, the basic instruments of monetary and fiscal policy, these guys do not have. Because everything, for a supposed independent country, everything has to go through France. Everything has to go through Paris. So as the president or prime minister of a francophone African country, if you want to, you believe that there's an airport or a bridge or something that needs to be built to grow the economy, that, this needs to be done to spark more trade, to grow the economy, then you can raise more tax revenue and use, which is how regular sovereign countries do business. You cannot go to the bond market and raise money like Nigeria can do, or like Kenya or South Africa can do. As a francophone country, you first have to fly to Paris and basically take permission from the Banque de France before you can do anything with your local monetary or fiscal policy. It sounds incredible to us, but that's the arrangement that these 14 countries have with France. And increasingly, that has become politically toxic within Africa. Increasingly, the young population of Africa detests the idea of not being functionally independent from France. They consider it to be not even neo-colonial, but to be openly colonial. That's how it's considered. They speak about it as though they are not actually independent yet, and France still has a stranglehold on their politics and on their economies, which is true. So I think what we are witnessing is not so much a thing of France necessarily retreating. It's more a thing of Francophone Africa's young population is coming into its own, and the information, or the access to information that their fathers or their grandfathers did not have, they have in excess, because pretty much everyone in urban Africa now has access to high-speed internet, cheap high-speed internet, and an internet-enabled device. That, in my opinion, is one of the most, or probably the most impactful thing that has ever happened on the continent of Africa, outside of in recent centuries, outside of political independence itself. Just the fact that these young populations now are able to actually find out the reason why they are poor, right? There is actually an explanation for it, that the reason why, for example, Nigeria is able to do certain things and generate a limited amount of prosperity for itself, whereas Cote d'Ivoire might not be able to, is because Nigeria has the ability to act as a sovereign country in certain ways that Cote d'Ivoire simply does not have. And these young people are able to read this information, link it to their immediate environments, and then they're able to connect with each other and form these informal groups, which essentially grow into political movements. That's how political movements are formed. So across Francophone Africa, they might not recognize it as such, but there is actually a growing political movement for economic and political independence from France. That's what we're witnessing, which is why when this coup took place in Niger, it was so easy for the coup junta to sell it to the Nigerian population as an anti-colonial, anti-French people's revolution, as against a military power grab, which, I mean, I personally still think it is. But from the point of view of the people of Niger, anything that promises to kick France out is better than the status quo, which is why anyone thinking that you're going to roll into Niamey and then you're going to restore Mohamed Bazoum and the status quo is going to be, it's going to go back to how it was and everything's going to be fine, that person's having a laugh. It's just not going to happen. This is not about the Nigerian military. It's the Nigerian people themselves who, the reason that the coup could even take place, it's often said that if a coup lasts longer than 24 hours, that it has been successful. And it's also said that a coup cannot take place without popular support. The reason the coup was able to take place in the first place was because the people themselves were willing to take that gamble, that anything is better than this pro-French, this French puppet administration we have in Niamey. So it's never going to be the same again. And it will keep on happening. Now, why I said that I'll be careful to use the term retreat is that I think the French are also aware of this. And I think there are other tools in the arsenal that they will deploy inevitably. I think one of the things we'll start to see is increased levels of separatist violence across West Africa. I think we'll start to see that, which is not to say that the French are going to, go around funding and arming separatist groups or jihadists or Islamists. That's not what I'm saying. However, I am saying that based on historical precedent, right, it's not hard to see that every time there is such a political movement within Francophone Africa, that somehow tends to be the outcome. All of a sudden, people start dying. And eventually what then tends to happen after a number of years is that when everyone simply gets weary of the continued violence, the economy isn't getting better, people are still poor, the promises that were made as a result of independence from France haven't come to be, then, you go back to what was comfortable and familiar. You invite the French back, which has happened before, by the way. So I'd be careful to use terms like retreat. However, it's definitely going to be interesting to see whether this time around, because of the sheer access to information provided by the internet and access to community and, the ability to congregate without being physically present, whether that is going to make a significant difference this time around. I'm very interested.
Thank you so much, David. It's been great to have you today on The Watchdog, and we hope that you will be able to come back again soon to discuss what is happening in West Africa. Now, to close off the show, I think it's important that we delve into some of the recent investigations that I and others have undertook. Now, particularly, I wanted to hone in on the campaign against the rock star Roger Waters. Now, many will be aware that he had Israel lobbyists like Christian Wakeford in British Parliament attempting to cancel his massively popular and well-attended shows in England. But also, what few noticed is that when he was performing his iconic anti-fascist sequence from the Pink Floyd album The Wall on stage in London, there was a particular member of the audience who attempted to pull out an Israeli flag. Now, we'll show that video now. As you can see, that person that attempted to pull out the flag was ejected from the audience. What's also less known is that an individual had a Palestinian flag also taken off them when they were attempting to enter the arena that night. But what was interesting is that after this situation of the pro-Israeli member of the audience pulling out the flag, you saw many in the British media push the idea that this was somebody who was the daughter of a Holocaust survivor who was being manhandled at the Roger Waters gig. Now, what I then did was I looked into who exactly this individual was, and I found out some quite interesting information. So not only was Yoshi Davis, the woman that took this action at the Roger Waters gig, a virulent supporter of Donald Trump, she also is a member of the Board of Deputies and also previously an activist / employee for the Israeli occupation forces lobby group, My Truth. Her work for the Israeli military was in fact so well received by the Israeli government that the Likud Minister of Justice, Omer Ohan, personally sent a video of thanks to Yoshi Davis. And we'll play that video now.
From the Ministry of Justice, I want to tell Yochi Davis and My Truth organization, thank you for providing justice. Thank you for providing the truth to the world. And thank you for everything that you are doing for the state of Israel and for the people of Israel. Thank you.
So here you see somebody that was presented by the British media as a flawless, innocent victim of security thuggery at a Roger Waters show was actually a propagandist for the Israeli military who received personal thanks from the Israeli Minister of Justice at the time. What we've also realized fairly recently is that the key functions of the British security state are being carried out by an Israeli intelligence-linked company. The phone and cloud hacking services that the British security agencies carry out, from the police to ones seemingly headed by the Foreign Office, are provided to them by the Israeli tech company Cellebrite. Now, Cellebrite is headed up by Dana Goethe, who actually is an alumni of Unit 8200 in the Israeli military. Now, Unit 8200 is the signals intelligence unit of the Israeli military, which is known for obtaining information about Palestinians via surveillance and then blackmailing them on that information that they have procured in these malevolent ways. Now, it's important also to know that Cellebrite, this company that carries out these services for the British security state, is across the company full of former Israeli military and intelligence personnel. What we also know is that Cellebrite is owned by Israeli Growth Partners. Now, Israeli Growth Partners is headed by Haim Shani. Haim Shani is the chairman of the UK Israel Tech Hub, which we've spoken about on this show previously. Now, the UK-Israel Tech Hub is based in the British Embassy in Israel, and it is staffed by former Israeli military and intelligence personnel and headed by Haim Shani, who himself was a director general at the Israeli Finance Ministry. Now, what we have to remember is that this organization is funded by the British government, and the UK-Israel Tech Hub works specifically to procure British contracts for Israeli companies. Now, Haim Shani is so popular with the British establishment that he was actually awarded an OBE by the late Queen Elizabeth. Now, Moshe Lichman, the other leader of Israel Growth Partners, began his career as a program manager at Israel's largest arms firm, Elbit Systems. So the point here is that you have Cellebrite, an organization that is essentially been founded almost as an extension of Israeli intelligence, working on key functions of British intelligence services for police services across the country. We also know that Nice Systems, a company that was previously headed up by Haim Shani, also has contracts with British police across the country. And Nice Systems, again, was founded by alumni of Unit 8200. It also seemingly has contracts in Ireland, despite the Irish government having a professed pro-Palestine position. It seems that the recorders that they use in their police stations have been provided by Nice Systems. And bear in mind that Alan Shatter, when he was Justice Minister of Ireland, brought this information to light. And he's an individual who has gone on to essentially become an Israel lobbyist. We also know that Nice Systems had a rollout of their technology in Glasgow, and they use facial recognition on CCTV and match it up to people's social media output. And so Nice Systems were rolled out in Glasgow City Council, and we do not know whether, again, the Scottish political class has a fairly good reputation for standing with Palestine. They recently blocked the anti-BDS legislation, which is being applied here. And of course, the most worrying aspect of this whole story is that Cellebrite claims to remotely control all of its devices, which would imply that Cellebrite have access to information procured through their devices by the British security services. So that brings us to the end of the show for today. Thank you for joining us. I hope that you can support us with our fundraiser for MintPress. At the moment, we are truly independent media investigating the powers that be in our society for the public interest. Thank you for joining us. Hope to see you next time.